One of my more recent trends with shipwreck videos was looking at debris fields. In this, I focused on the discoveries by RV Petrel. They were often quite good at looking at debris fields, be it Hornet, Lexington, or other ships. And for today's shipwreck video, we'll be returning to their most famous discovery, USS Indianapolis. I've previously covered the wreck proper, although that was one of my first wreck videos. Today, we'll be looking at the debris field instead. Quite a few interesting bits fell away as this ship sank, from the bridge structure to the mast and the scout aircraft. And of course, the turrets. That is a very uncommon find to say the least, and is probably the single most interesting piece of debris. We'll get to that, but only later in this video. First, we have to do a brief overview of the sinking. Albeit with this ship, I don't think I really need to say much. Indianapolis is a very famous sinking, either because of the historical aspect or because of Jaws. I covered it in more detail in my initial wreck video, and that will, of course, be linked in the description. For now, the short version. This is a story that took place at the tail end of the Pacific War, when Indianapolis, fresh off repair work, was assigned to carry parts for the atomic bomb. With the ship departing on July 16th of 1945. The ship would reach Tinian on July 26th, dropping off her precious cargo. This part of the voyage was uneventful. On the other hand, her next trip would not be so simple. Indianapolis departed the Marianas on July 28th to sail for Leyte. There she would rejoin the fleet for further actions against Japan. However, the cruiser would never arrive. 2 days later, just after midnight on July 30th, Indianapolis was hit by 2 torpedoes. Those were fired by the submarine I-58, and they doomed the cruiser. Within 15 minutes, Indianapolis had capsized and sank. Around 300 of the crew went down with the ship, leaving just under 900 men in the water. Unfortunately, their story is well known. The men would drift in the water for 3.5 days before they were spotted. All the while, men were attacked by sharks, in addition to suffering from dehydration and exposure. Ultimately, only 316 men would be rescued. In the aftermath of this sinking, blame flew in all directions, with much of it directed in the court-martial of Captain Charles McVay. This would be controversial even at the time, and only became more so later on, even with the captain of I-58 himself saying that zigzagging wouldn't have mattered. That is a topic for another day. McVay would ultimately be exonerated in 2000. As for his ship, Indianapolis vanished in the depths. Her story never faded, but the ship wouldn't be discovered for a very long time. Early attempts came soon after McVay's exoneration, in July of 2001. This failed to find anything. The same held true for another expedition in 2005. Ultimately, the ship wasn't located until August 19th of 2017. One of the earlier discoveries by the team on RV Petrel, funded by Paul Allen. They found Indianapolis in mostly one piece. The bow broke off, but the rest of the hull remained together, although the stern deck had collapsed in on itself and both bow turrets fell out. With the wreck at a depth of 18,044 feet, or 5,500 meters, the preservation is impressive. Much of the paint is intact, and details can still be made out. From the damage to the ship to the number 35 on her bow. However, I covered all of this already. This video will focus on the debris field that was discovered at the same time. And since we're already on the topic of the bow, we'll begin there, or rather here on the sonar map, which does a good job of showing how much of the bow broke off when you look at the main wreck. As for the bow itself, that is rough. Not that this is particularly surprising with the violence of the sinking. As you can see, it buried itself pretty far into the bottom. This is the very tip of the bow seen here on the surface. And on this side of the ship, it's pretty well buried. On the other side, however, it's not quite so bad. We have much of the bow visible, including the anchor, and some anchor chain down toward the bottom. There's also some clear rusting visible on the side, with some rusticles dripping down toward the chain. Something more visible when you move closer to the anchor, although the anchor itself is remarkably free of rust, to the point that the manufacturer markings are still clearly legible. I touched on this in my initial video, but it's still impressive now. We've seen anchors on other shipwrecks, but none have this level of preservation. Most are more rusty to some extent or another. This one might as well be pristine in comparison, which can also be said further along with the number on the bow. Indianapolis is number 35, which is also clearly visible. Admittedly, it has faded, but I'd be more surprised if it were perfectly intact. That doesn't change how well preserved it was, at least in 2017. For comparison, here's Yorktown's number from the NOAA survey. As for Indianapolis, there's even a clear dividing line between the paint right below the 35. Although just behind there, we reach the area where the metal was torn apart. The video doesn't show that area in detail, but even this bit here shows a good idea of how bad it is. That said, this is the end of the bow pictures. The next area we'll touch on is the bridge. Similar to the bow, this fell away during the sinking and buried itself into the bottom. That will be a bit of a running theme in this video. On the other debris fields I've covered, the debris is often resting on top of the seafloor. On this one, likely due to the speed of the sinking, it's largely buried. Here we're at the top of the bridge tower. There's a couple noteworthy things. First, how intact everything is. The mast is broken, yes, but everything else is still there, right down to the railing. You can see this area pretty well on the surface in this picture, from shortly before her final voyage. Meanwhile, the second note is tied to the first in the preservation of this area. While there's quite a bit of rust on the bottom, here and here, the area is otherwise well preserved. Although that preservation does fall apart a little further down in this area. More rusticles are present, and the corrosion is definitely worse. At the same time, the structure remains intact, from the tub here to the ladder further back. Bouncing back to the surface shot, this area is right around here. Now, as we move further down, things do continue to get rougher. This is closer to the area where the tower broke away. Although the area itself is in shadow, we can only get a hint of it around here. However, it is a very telling sign how much rustier this area is. The more damaged an area is on a wreck, the faster it rusts away. As for the next picture, we get a closer look at one of those tubs. Petrel identified that as a director position for the 40mm Bofors guns. The next picture, meanwhile, doesn't have much to touch on. We've seen most of this area in the previous shots, if only in the background. But it does have one particularly important note. The ship's bells resting on the metal here. When you move closer in, it's easier to make them both out. This is an area I touched on in my first video because of those bells. Although, to my knowledge, there was never any serious consideration given to recovering them. Not like Hood. In any event, we'll leave off this section of the bridge with this picture from further out, which has, among other things, a cameo by a large fish. And of more interest to wrecked viewers, the base of the mast here, with the next picture probably more interesting in general. Leaving aside all the loose cabling, this is apparently a radio room, although very little of it remains. This part was torn up pretty badly in the sinking, exposing the radio room itself to the elements. That's led to much of the equipment rusting away. Petrel zoomed in here, but the remains aren't particularly recognizable. We'll see better preserved equipment of this nature later on in the video. For this area, the final image of note is the aft mast, which, unsurprisingly, also fell away during the sinking. It landed a good bit away from the main hull, although it remained broadly intact all the way down. Even if, much like everything else, it got buried pretty deeply. You can tell by looking at the structure here, and going back a bit further down the mast here to compare against. While the next piece of debris for its part is a 5-inch gun director, which I believe came from here on the surface picture. On the bottom, it's one of the best preserved parts of this wreck. Aside from the rusting, this looks practically brand new. Very, very little of the paint has faded. I believe that Indianapolis is so well preserved in this regard, in large part due to how recent her final refit was. While the ship raced across the Pacific at record speeds, she was still less than a month out of a major overhaul when she sank. Her paint was basically brand new. However, as impressive as the gun director is, the next piece is even more interesting. Here we have intact radio equipment. Again, the paint on the exterior has held up pretty well, but it's the inside that is important here. Past the silt and the rust, we have a completely intact piece of communication equipment. The dials are there, and the writing is all legible. I don't think any other piece of equipment on any of these wrecks has been quite so well preserved. It looks like you could clean it off and put the thing back into use. Moving on from there, we have one of the kill tallies found painted on the debris. I believe this came from one of her gun tubs, although I'm not entirely sure. Regardless, we can make out the silhouette of a bomber, and above that, 9 Japanese flags. So at least 9 kills. More might once have been there, but it's hard to tell. In any case, the next few images are all the remnants of her scout aircraft. I won't linger long here, simply because there's not much to note. First, we have a spare float. The strut is largely intact, where it would be attached to the scout. The rest of the float, on the other hand, is a bit of a wreck, with metal peeled and torn away, likely when it was thrown from the wreck. It's a similar story with the scout itself. Frankly speaking, there's not much left. Just the float and a little bit of the fuselage. Neither of the wings have survived in any recognizable state, and the engine seems to have buried itself into the bottom. On the other hand, as we zoom in from this picture, there is something important to note. Once again, surprisingly intact details. In this case, right behind the back of a seat. Much of it is overgrown with marine life, of course, but it remains interesting to look at. Beyond this, there's a couple scattered bits of plane debris, such as a tail here with its markings clearly visible, and what I believe to be part of the catapult behind it. There's also a couple wings, or wing fragments, as the case may be. This one has the roundel clearly visible, although it's pretty worn down, while this one has the other side of the roundel along with the strut for the float. And that rounds off the aircraft. The next pictures will be of decidedly smaller debris. First, we have a gas mask, once again buried in the bottom, but you can still see the goggle here, along with the empty filter just ahead of it, with this being something else unique to this wreck. I can't recall seeing one of these on any other warship wreck. A more haunting image, however, is a field of loose helmets. I'll note, as I have before, that these probably aren't tied to any bodies. That doesn't change how painful this image can be when you think about these survivors and what they went through while waiting for rescue. Something that also applies to this image, where we have a lone medical box, the red cross still plainly visible as it rests in scattered debris. With the next image continuing this humanizing trend, if in a less morbid manner. A rotted box of toothpaste or shaving cream. The tubes have remained in place where their box rotted away, with even the color of their caps still recognizable. That aside, we're nearing the end of this video. 2 more major pieces of debris are left. First, what Petrel identified as a director base near the stern of the ship. There's not much to touch on here. It's another large piece of well-preserved debris. The final images, on the other hand, are the really interesting ones, because that is one of the main battery turrets buried almost completely in the bottom. If you ever wanted an indication of how fast that debris was falling, well, this shows it. While the turret is largely intact, it is still buried. None of the gun barrels can be seen because this is buried halfway into the bottom. Looking at it from above just makes that more clear. The only really recognizable parts are the rangefinder ears and the doors in the side, along with the overall shape of this early 8-inch turret. We see both of those features here, and here on the other side, where the protective casing of the rangefinder is missing, along with the door, with this giving us a distant look inside the turret, along with another good look at just how deeply it got buried. It's one thing to know a turret fell away. It's another entirely to see it like this. It seemed a good point to win the video to me. This is the kind of thing you just don't see on other wreck sites. A reminder of the suddenness of this sinking. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.